It was the spring of 1935 in Harlem, New York, a neighborhood alive with music, culture, and the promise of a better life, but also burdened by hardship and deep frustrations. The Great Depression had struck Harlem hard. Families struggled to find work, landlords raised rents on overcrowded apartments, and resentment simmered beneath the surface. It was in this climate of tension that one incident, magnified by whispers and word of mouth, would ignite a storm that no one could contain. It all began with a story that spread rapidly through the community. People said that a young boy, caught in a local store, had been mistreated over something as small as a penknife. The rumor claimed that his life had been taken because of it. Whether the details were true or distorted, what mattered was how quickly the tale traveled. Within hours, it stirred emotions that had been bottled up for years. Anger, grief, and a sense of injustice flooded the streets. Crowds gathered outside the store. Some came looking for answers, others for justice. Voices rose, fists clenched, and the weight of economic despair and racial inequality pressed down on the neighborhood like never before. What began as murmurs of concern escalated into shouts of outrage. Harlem streets, normally filled with jazz and laughter, now carried the sounds of protest and unrest. The spark had been lit. The events that followed would leave an indelible mark on American history, remembered not just as a reaction to one rumor, but as an explosion of long-suppressed pain and frustration. This was not simply about a boy or a store, it was about a community that felt unheard, unseen, and pushed beyond its breaking point. As we uncover the story of the Harlem Riot of 1935, we'll see how this moment revealed the cracks in a society that claimed to promise equality but delivered hardship instead. Stay with us as we journey into the heart of Harlem, tracing how a single rumor grew into something far larger, a cry that still echoes today. If you're interested in stories that history tried to silence, make sure to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and hit the notification bell so you won't miss the next chapter in uncovering the truth behind the events that shaped our world. In the heart of Harlem during the mid-1930s, the streets carried more than just the rhythms of jazz and the hum of everyday life. Beneath the vibrant culture lay a community weighed down by struggles that seemed to have no end. Families who had moved north in search of opportunity often found themselves boxed in by barriers they had never anticipated. Jobs were scarce, wages unfair, and landlords demanded more than many could afford. Every corner of Harlem told a story of resilience, but also of simmering discontent. When whispers began to circulate about an injustice involving a young boy, those stories no longer stayed hidden. The rumor acted less like news and more like a spark dropped onto dry kindling. For years, frustration had been building in the neighborhood, and suddenly, people found a reason to give voice to the pain that had long been silenced. The anger was not just about one boy or one store. It was about the constant reminder that Harlem's residents were treated differently, on the streets, in schools, in workplaces, and especially by those in power. Discrimination was not an isolated occurrence, it was a daily reality. People felt as though they were always on the outside looking in, denied the respect and fairness others seemed to take for granted. That sense of exclusion grew heavier with each passing year. On top of that, poverty stretched across the community like a shadow. During the Great Depression, when America as a whole suffered, Harlem carried an even greater burden. While some neighborhoods found ways to recover, Harlem seemed to be left behind. Bread lines were longer, opportunities fewer, and hopes for better days often faded into quiet resignation. Parents worried about feeding their children, young men and women longed for work that never came, and dreams of prosperity were replaced by the struggle to simply get through the week. And then there was the relationship with authority. Encounters with police, meant to provide safety, often left residents feeling the opposite. Many in Harlem felt they were treated with suspicion or hostility, their voices ignored when they sought protection or fairness. This sense of being targeted and misunderstood deepened the divide between the people and those sworn to serve them. So when the rumor spread, it wasn't received as just another piece of gossip. It struck a chord, one that resonated with every frustration Harlem had endured. People heard the story and thought of their own hardships, the job applications rejected, the families crowded into tiny apartments, the times they had been disrespected or dismissed. The boys' story became a mirror reflecting all their struggles back at them. The streets began to fill, not only with those who believed the rumor but with those who carried the weight of accumulated anger. What they sought was not only justice for one incident but recognition of their dignity, their humanity, and their right to be heard. The rumor was the tipping point, but the force behind it came from years of wounds left unattended. As the unrest gathered strength, Harlem's mood shifted from quiet frustration to an undeniable roar. The energy was raw, and the air was thick with a mix of fear, sorrow, and determination. What unfolded in those hours and days would not simply be remembered as a reaction to a single event, but as a moment when a community's long-suppressed voice demanded attention. This was Harlem at a crossroads, a neighborhood that had given the world art, music, and creativity now revealing the other side of its story, the struggle for fairness and the yearning for change. And while the rumor lit the match, it was the deeper injustices, left unresolved for too long, that truly fueled the fire. The Harlem of the 1930s was a place of contrasts. On one hand, it was the beating heart of black culture in America, a neighborhood where poets, musicians, and thinkers gave voice to dreams of a brighter future. On the other, it was also a place where daily survival was an unrelenting struggle. The Great Depression had slammed into Harlem with a force that left scars not just on buildings and businesses, but on the lives of thousands who called it home. Work was the most immediate concern. Factories cut back, offices closed their doors, and stores that once bustled with energy now stood nearly empty. Across the city, jobs grew scarce, but in Harlem, the problem was even sharper. Many residents discovered that when positions did open, they were rarely offered to them. Employers often chose to hire elsewhere, leaving men and women who were more than willing to work with nothing to turn to but endless waiting. Days stretched into weeks, weeks into months, and the line outside the employment office never seemed to shrink. This was not simply about the absence of jobs, it was about the sting of being overlooked time and again. A talented seamstress might find her skills dismissed. A strong laborer might be told there was no room for him on the crew. The message was clear, opportunities existed, but they were not meant for everyone. This sense of being deliberately shut out cut deeper than the hunger that came from empty cupboards. It bred a quiet fury, the kind that builds in silence until it can no longer be contained. In homes across Harlem, families tried to make do with what little they had. Apartments already cramped with too many people now had to stretch their limits even further. Rent collectors came knocking, but pay envelopes were empty. Children felt the weight of their parents' worry. Meals were smaller, sometimes skipped altogether, and the idea of tomorrow being better seemed more like a distant dream than a real possibility. The inequality wasn't confined to work or wages, it was visible in every corner of life. Schools had fewer resources, hospitals often turned people away, and basic services were inconsistent at best. A feeling grew among Harlem's residents that the city benefited from their presence when it came to music, art, and entertainment, yet offered little in return when it came to security and fairness. The resentment that spread during these years wasn't born overnight. It was the product of countless small injustices piled on top of one another. Each job application turned down, each landlord's demand, each encounter where dignity was denied added to the weight pressing down on the community. By the mid-1930s, that weight had become unbearable. Resentment shaped the way people saw their world. What once might have been a minor slight now carried the force of accumulated pain. A rumor, an incident, even a misunderstanding could feel like the final straw. The Depression may have officially been an economic crisis, but in Harlem, it was also a social one. It exposed the deep fault lines in the way the city treated its residents, and it made clear who was seen as deserving of help and who was left to fend for themselves. This climate of exclusion and hardship set the stage for what was to come. The resentment was not aimless, it was focused, sharp, and waiting for release. Harlem was a community that had given much to the nation, yet felt consistently pushed aside. The Great Depression didn't just bring unemployment, it magnified inequality, carving a wound into the heart of Harlem that could not be ignored. When the spark finally came, it landed on ground already dry and ready to burn. What began as a gathering of voices soon transformed into something far more turbulent. The streets of Harlem, already tense with frustration and anticipation, became the stage for a sudden and dramatic shift. People who had come to witness or to speak out now found themselves swept into a tide of emotion that could no longer be contained. The energy of the crowd grew heavier, pulsing with anger, fear, and a desperate need to be heard. Shouts echoed between the buildings, bouncing from one block to the next until it felt as though the entire neighborhood was caught in a single heartbeat. The first signs of unrest came almost quietly: a window cracked, a door pushed too hard, but once that line was crossed, restraint disappeared. The air filled with the sound of glass shattering, each crash like a declaration that the patience of Harlem had run out. Shops that had stood as familiar landmarks were suddenly vulnerable. Some residents struck out against them, seeing in their walls and displays a symbol of the inequality they endured daily. Others joined in simply because the moment carried them forward, because standing still felt impossible when so many around them were moving with raw intensity. Crowds surged down the avenues, leaving behind a trail of broken storefronts and scattered goods. Confrontations with authority quickly followed. Uniformed officers, dispatched to contain the unrest, found themselves face to face with men and women who had reached the breaking point. The tension between the two sides was palpable, one representing order as defined by the city, the other representing a community demanding acknowledgement of its suffering. Words gave way to shoves, shoves to scuffles, and scuffles to full clashes. The streets became a battleground where neither side seemed willing to retreat. For many in Harlem, these confrontations weren't just about the events of that night. Each push against authority carried the weight of years of mistreatment. Each thrown object or shouted word was fueled by countless past encounters that had left people feeling powerless. What unfolded wasn't random chaos, it was a surge of collective memory and emotion bursting into the open. The scene was chaotic, but beneath the noise lay a clear message: Harlem was no longer willing to suffer in silence. Every broken window, every raised fist, every defiant stand in front of a police officer was a symbol of voices long ignored. The neighborhood, usually alive with music and laughter, now roared with the sound of discontent. As the night deepened, the intensity spread from block to block. Flames of frustration, once hidden behind closed doors and whispered conversations, were now visible for the entire city to see. The line between protest and confrontation had vanished, leaving behind only the undeniable reality of a community in revolt. In those hours, Harlem was transformed. What had begun as a search for answers about a boy's fate had erupted into something far larger, a reckoning with injustice, poverty, and neglect. The violent clashes were more than outbursts of anger, they were declarations that the community could not and would not remain silent any longer. And though the damage to property was visible in broken glass and empty shelves, the deeper story was written in the determination of a people who had decided that enough was enough. As the night unfolded, the city's officials realized that the unrest in Harlem was not fading away. What began as scattered protests had swelled into something louder, larger, and more determined. Streets that only hours earlier carried the rhythm of everyday life now trembled under the weight of shouting crowds, broken glass, and a growing demand for justice. City leaders, anxious to contain the turmoil, made a choice that would alter the night's course even further. They sent in more officers, armed and ready to assert control. The arrival of these forces did not calm the neighborhood, it ignited it. Batons swung, orders were shouted, and the people who had gathered to demand answers were met not with dialogue but with intimidation. To the residents of Harlem, the show of strength was not a sign of protection. It was a reminder of the imbalance they already lived with daily. Instead of quelling anger, the heavy-handed tactics fed it, transforming frustration into fury. On one corner, a group of young men watched as officers advanced through the crowd. They had grown up seeing neighbors stopped without reason, parents treated with disrespect, and friends dragged off for minor offenses. To them, this was not just one more confrontation, it was the proof that their community's cries for fairness were being dismissed yet again. They resisted, not only with words but with sheer defiance, pushing back against a force that had too often dictated the terms of their lives. Elsewhere, mothers tried to pull their children away from the chaos, but the clash was impossible to escape. Tear gas burned in the air, carrying with it a bitter sting that made eyes water and lungs ache. The smoke curled down avenues and into doorways, seeping into spaces that had once felt safe. Each step the authorities took into Harlem seemed to confirm what many already believed: their neighborhood was not seen as a community in need of care, but as a problem to be controlled. As the confrontation spread, the divide grew deeper. Residents saw friends beaten, neighbors arrested, and the streets they called home turned into arenas of conflict. What had been anger aimed at injustice now hardened into a profound sense of betrayal. Every strike of a baton reinforced the idea that the city's response to their pain was not compassion but punishment. Some leaders tried desperately to calm the situation, calling for peace even as the sound of sirens and the crack of glass filled the night. Yet their voices were often drowned out by the reality unfolding in front of them. The people no longer trusted promises of change, not when the present moment showed them the sharp edge of authority. By the time the dust began to settle, Harlem carried new scars. The force meant to silence unrest had instead deepened it, leaving behind wounds that could not be measured by property damage or arrest numbers. These were wounds of spirit and trust, felt in the hearts of those who had seen their community treated as less than worthy of justice. In that clash, the authorities may have regained control of the streets, but they lost something far greater: the confidence of Harlem's residents. The very measures meant to enforce order had only confirmed what many had long believed, that their voices would never be respected until they forced the world to listen. And so the night's legacy was not one of submission, but of rising determination, born from the sting of suppression and the fire of resilience. When the sun finally rose over Harlem, it revealed a neighborhood forever changed. The streets that only a day before carried the sounds of laughter, vendors, and music now stood in eerie silence, bearing the weight of what had unfolded through the long, chaotic night. Shattered glass crunched beneath the feet of early risers who stepped cautiously outside, their eyes scanning the damage with disbelief. Storefronts once filled with goods and light were now hollowed-out shells, their windows gaping open like wounds. Signs hung crooked, metal gates bent out of shape, and piles of debris lined the sidewalks. But the scars on the streets told only part of the story. Far more devastating were the tolls that could not be swept away or rebuilt. Families whispered the names of loved ones who would not be returning home. Behind drawn curtains, grief settled heavily in households where life had been cut short. 3 lives had ended during the turmoil, each loss echoing far beyond a single family. For the community, those deaths were not just tragedies, they were stark reminders of how high the cost of being unheard could become. Hospitals across the city were crowded with the injured, their hallways filled with groans, hurried footsteps, and the tense voices of nurses and doctors working tirelessly. Around 125 people bore the physical reminders of the night: bruises, broken bones, deep cuts, and the lingering sting of smoke and gas. Some had been caught in the crossfire while trying to protect their families. Others had stood firm in the streets, unwilling to back down even as the risk grew greater. Each bandaged wound told its own story of courage, fear, and survival. Business owners returned to their shops, shaking their heads as they surveyed the wreckage. For many, the shelves had been cleared, their livelihoods ripped apart in hours of unrest. These stores had been built with years of hard work, late nights, and sacrifice. Now, they stood as symbols of a neighborhood's collective anger, anger that had found expression in destruction when no other outlet seemed possible. While insurance claims and repairs might someday restore the buildings, the trust between merchants and the people they served would take far longer to rebuild. And yet, amid the sorrow and devastation, there was also a sense of clarity. The scale of damage could no longer be ignored by those in power. Harlem's pain had been laid bare for the world to see, its cries for justice amplified through broken windows and smoldering ruins. The night's toll, 3 dead, more than 100 wounded, countless livelihoods disrupted, was too heavy to dismiss as a simple disturbance. It demanded recognition, forcing a city, and eventually a nation, to reckon with why such desperation had erupted in the first place. Conversations began in kitchens, churches, and community halls. Some spoke of mourning, others of rebuilding, and still others of the need to turn the tragedy into a catalyst for change. Parents warned their children of the dangers they had witnessed, while young voices questioned why their community was always the one left suffering. The numbers, 125, untold damages, became more than statistics. They were woven into Harlem's collective memory, etched into the stories passed down from one generation to the next. In the end, the riot did not simply leave behind destruction. It left behind a testament to the depth of Harlem's frustration, the urgency of its demands, and the high price that communities often pay when their pleas go unanswered. The broken glass could be swept, the storefronts repaired, but the losses endured, the lives taken, the wounds inflicted, the spirit tested, would remain long after the streets had quieted. Harlem had spoken, and the world could no longer pretend not to hear. In the weeks that followed the upheaval, as Harlem tried to regain its footing, the city's leaders were under pressure to explain what had happened. To many outsiders, the unrest had seemed sudden, sparked by a single rumor about a boy in a store. But those who lived in Harlem knew better. They understood that what the world had witnessed was not a random eruption, it was the breaking point of tensions that had been building for years. A mayoral commission was formed, charged with studying the causes of the violence and providing answers that the public could trust. Its members walked the same streets where glass still glittered in the gutters and spoke with residents whose voices carried both exhaustion and determination. They sifted through testimony, data, and reports, searching for the truth beneath the chaos. And when their findings were released, they confirmed what Harlem had long been saying: the riot was never only about one boy, one incident, or one rumor. The Commission's report laid bare the deeper story, a story of inequality woven into the very fabric of daily life in Harlem. It spoke of families crammed into deteriorating apartments where plumbing often failed and walls cracked under the weight of neglect. Overcrowding had become the norm, with multiple families forced to share spaces meant for far fewer. Rent was high, yet the quality of living was painfully low. For residents, home was supposed to be a place of safety, but in Harlem, even home reflected the broader injustice of the city. Employment told a similar tale. While the Great Depression had touched every corner of America, Harlem's black residents bore a disproportionate share of its cruelty. Jobs were scarce, and when positions did open, they were often closed to them. Those who did find work were given the hardest tasks for the lowest pay, with little hope of advancement. Men and women alike faced the sting of rejection time and again, not because they lacked skill or ambition, but because of barriers they could not control. To live under such conditions was to carry a constant reminder that the playing field was never level. The Commission also pointed to the daily reality of discrimination. It was felt in schools, where opportunities were limited. It was felt in hospitals, where care was unequal. It was felt most keenly in encounters with authority, where respect was rarely given. These patterns of mistreatment were not isolated, they formed a system that weighed heavily on every aspect of Harlem life. By the time the boy's story spread through the neighborhood, the people were already living under immense pressure. The rumor was not the cause of the eruption, it was the spark that ignited a fire waiting to burn. The Commission's findings made clear that the riot was the language of a community forced into silence for too long, a dramatic response to years of injustice that could no longer be endured quietly. For the city, the report was a call to action. But for Harlem, it was simply validation. At last, someone in power had said aloud what residents had been living with for decades: the unrest was rooted not in chaos or criminality, but in systemic inequality, poverty, and discrimination. These were not problems that could be solved with more police on the streets or stricter laws. They were problems that demanded deep change in housing, in employment, and in the recognition of basic dignity. The Commission's conclusion did not heal Harlem's wounds, but it gave shape to a truth the community already knew in its bones. What happened that night was not an isolated tragedy, it was the visible symptom of an invisible disease. And unless that disease was confronted, the city would remain vulnerable to the same explosions of frustration in the years to come. When history looks back at Harlem in 1935, it sees more than just a night of shattered windows and burned-out shops. It sees a turning point. The events that shook that neighborhood were not the first time communities had risen in anger, but they marked the beginning of something new, a modern pattern that would echo across America throughout the 20th century. Harlem's unrest became the blueprint for future uprisings, not because people wanted destruction, but because they had no other way to make their voices heard when years of injustice had pushed them past endurance. What made Harlem different was how clearly it revealed the connection between systemic inequality and public outcry. This was not chaos without cause. It was not random disorder. It was a message written on the streets, in broken glass and bruised bodies, that neglect, poverty, and discrimination could only be ignored for so long before they erupted. Harlem's message did not fade when the smoke cleared. Instead, it planted seeds of awareness, both in the city and in the nation. In the decades that followed, other cities would experience their own uprisings. From Detroit to Los Angeles, from Newark to Watts, the story would repeat. Communities burdened by poverty, poor housing, and discrimination would rise in frustration, demanding to be seen and heard. Each of those later events carried Harlem's legacy within it, a reminder of that night in 1935 when America witnessed the first modern outpouring of urban anger. For Harlem itself, the memory became part of its identity. The riot was not just a scar, it was a warning and a lesson. It showed the cost of ignoring inequality, but it also showed the strength of a community willing to stand together, even in the face of overwhelming force. Harlem's story in 1935 was painful, but it was also powerful. It forced the city, and eventually the nation, to confront truths it had long tried to look away from. And so, the Harlem Riot of 1935 stands in history as more than just a local disturbance. It was a marker, a signal that the struggles of Black Americans could not remain hidden in the shadows of city streets. It set a pattern that history would revisit again and again, each time reminding the world of the unfinished work of justice. If you found this story meaningful, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps bring more untold histories to light. And now, as we close this chapter of Harlem's past, I wish you a peaceful night. Sleep well, and may tomorrow bring new understanding.